Hey, Jeff Johnston here, host of the Living Undeterred podcast. I'm so excited to have my special guest and new good friend, Bailey Farren, on from California. I don't remember what town specifically. I should know. But, our story is kind of funny. So when I introduce you, I want to go a little bit about how we met and just sometimes how randomness is so awesome, and kind of how your path just intertwines with somebody and you don't really know why, but there's something in there. So, but super excited to have you on the show. I mean, you're going to bring a really neat perspective today from what we normally hear on the show. But I do think in the market that you're in, Bailey, that there's a lot we can discuss that permeates all things mental health, things like that are so close to my heart. But anyway, Bailey, thanks for being on the show. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and it was great to meet you in person, so serendipitously on an airplane. And
Yeah.
I am in Berkeley, California.
Berkeley. You went to Berkeley, right?
I did.
That's what I thought. Okay, so I have to paint the backdrop here a little bit. So a lot of my guests I meet, I met them on LinkedIn. That's probably where I get most of my guests. And either I inject my opinion into some conversation or somebody comments on one of my posts, and the next thing they're on my podcast, I'm on their podcast. And our meeting was a little bit, uh, less formal, I guess. We were seated next to each other on a plane. And, in the past, before all this stuff happened in my life, I was probably a lot more quiet. People probably would disagree with that, but I was a little bit more reserved, I'd reading my book or whatever. But when you sat down, I just felt like, you seem like somebody that likes to talk or have conversations, especially in a 2.5 hour flight. And so we just started talking. And, at some point I talked about my startup company. I was like really kind of proud that we have a startup, but, we haven't even launched yet. We're so far pre-seed, it's not even funny. And then you're like, well, yeah, I have one too. And I'm like, what? Because I know you're young, and I'm like, wow, that's impressive. I waited for, a long time to start a startup. And so you started telling me about your startup company, and I'm like, wow, this is amazing. And then we just started going down roads of spirituality and oneness with the universe and how we can help our fellow humans improve their well-being. And it was just like all of a sudden the flight was over.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, I want to continue talking to this person. She's very engaging and just somebody that I have just lots of questions for, because I admire what you've done at such a young age. And we have so many commonalities in regards to interests with some of the things that we discussed that we can share a little bit later on the show. But anyway, why don't you just tell a little bit about what you do, surprise our audience, because I think people looking at you wouldn't see kind of what you run and what as a founder and CEO of a startup, kind of what you came up with. The story behind it is beautiful. I mean, where this whole thing started, I'd like to have you share that. So yeah, tell
Yeah.
us about Perimeter. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes.
Perimeter. Okay. Where this came from and why it's important to you.
Absolutely. So the long story short is Perimeter is a mapping platform that me and my team started to help first responders share information with each other and with the public during natural disasters. And
Mm-hmm.
a few years ago, before I started this, I never could have imagined that I would be in some kind of data science public safety company. But I'm from a place called Santa Rosa, which is in Northern California, and most recently pretty famous for the wildfires that we've been having in our community. And
Mm-hmm.
I have been evacuated with my family 5 times in the past 8 years from fires out
Mm-hmm.
there. And my parents are both first responders in the community. So my dad
Mm-hmm.
was a firefighter. And during one of the most devastating fires, it was called Tubbs. I was being evacuated. I was helping my mom get out, and we had no information about what to do, where to go, which roads were safe, if there were shelters, if there were hazards we needed to avoid,
Mm-hmm.
where the fire was, etc. And meanwhile, I'm a college student at UC Berkeley, which is about an hour away. I was there in Santa Rosa to help my mom get out. And I'm kind of swimming in technology, it seems, because I'm at this university that's kind of living right next to Silicon Valley, right?
Right.
The tech capital of the world. And so I have I have apps and, technologies to help me get any information that I could want. I can track a burrito every meter on its way to my apartment as it's being
Yep, you
delivered.
can.
But when I really needed to leverage technology most, when I needed those answers, we didn't have anything. And at first I thought, like, how could this be? First responders, the firefighters, they must have all this information they need to respond to the fire. They must know where the fire is, where the hazards are, where the roads are closed,
Right.
etc. They must just not have a way of getting that information to residents like us. And I started interviewing folks at the fire department and the other public safety agencies. And what I found out is my assumption was totally incorrect. The
Hmm.
first responders didn't have information either. So my
What were they?
dad,
What were they going off of?
they use paper maps and radios.
Oh
And
man.
so their way of getting situational awareness data, so information about what's happening around them, is almost entirely from radio between folks on scene. And if, let's say, a chief is trying to track someone like my dad who's out in the field, the way that he does that right now is basically we'll draw, like, okay, what's your location? Let me use my Sharpie and draw you on a map and then check in again 2 hours later. And
Oh
so
wow.
this
That's that with lives on the line. That's just insane. That's how
exactly.
it was operated. How many? So that's been operating that way for a long time.
Yeah, there's this phrase in the fire service specifically that says 200 years of 200 years unimpeded by progress. 200
Yeah.
years of tradition unimpeded by progress. And so, yeah, we are literally using World War II technology
Hmm.
to respond to the kind of natural disasters we've just never seen before. The fires that have been, that we've seen in the past few years are just, I mean, record setting doesn't speak to the half of it. It's just the fires and other incidents, hurricanes,
Yeah,
etc., have been
I'd like to
worse.
talk I'd like to talk about that a little bit later for sure because I'd like to get your thoughts on that whole picture there.
Yeah,
But so the systems are pretty outdated, pretty archaic, and you've come up with this idea while in college that hey, we should be embracing the newer technology, the speed of information, especially with lives at stake.
yeah.
Your parents for one. That was your kind of your why, right? I mean at a minimum, you wanted to make this a little bit safer, a lot safer for those people that, you care about the most.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I was making decisions about, like, am I going to apply for a job or am I going to do this super crazy idea that most people are telling me can't be done? Like, am I really going to try to do that when I'm
Why
22?
were they telling you that? Because of like your age, maybe, or the fact you're female, or
I
was
think
it just
there,
these stigmas out there that were biasing people's opinions?
yeah, it's a good question. I think there were a lot of compounding reasons. First and foremost, I think the space that we're operating, like government technology, is one that Silicon Valley and Silicon Valley investors tends to shy away from. GovTech is a very unpopular unpopular business model,
Just because of
selling
red
into
tape, or
government. Yeah, because of red tape, and each government agency operates a little bit differently. So
hmm
they might be neighboring counties in the same state, but they might have a completely different way of doing things. And so there's so many hoops to jump through that it's just way more convoluted than selling, let's say, to a big business that might be a little
mm,
bit more straightforward, that doesn't have
right,
procurement thresholds and all of these times set up for legal reasons.
right.
And so, one, they said, that's just really hard. And yes, I think as a 22-year-old young woman, they saw
Wow.
me and they're like, she has no idea what she's getting into. And as soon as she realizes how hard this is, she's going to quit. And
Oh, they underestimated Bailey.
yeah, and I think that given my high energy levels, people meet me and they assume that I'm, with regards to like the tortoise versus the hare, they meet me and they're going to think, oh, high energy. She's going to be the hare. She's going to burn out. She's going to go super
Right.
quick. She's going to, end up crashing somewhere.
Yeah.
But the way that I operate is much more like a tortoise. I'm just slow and methodical and
Mm-hmm.
consistent every day for years.
Mm-hmm.
And I've needed to be. And I've wondered in the past, like, how could someone run a startup that they're not completely passionate about or obsessed with? Because for me, this journey has been so challenging that if I didn't feel like I needed to solve the problem, or at least make a dent in it,
Mm-hmm.
that I don't know how I would have continued through some of those really hard times. But like you said, I knew when I was making that decision, like, do I apply for a job or do I do this crazy thing? I knew that these fires and other types of natural disasters were going to keep hitting my hometown
Mm-hmm.
specifically and the place that I'm from over the next few years. And if let's say I went and got another job in tech and I looked back and Santa Rosa got hit by another fire and people lost their lives, I would always know in the back of my mind that maybe I could have done something.
Right.
And I didn't want to live wondering what it would have been like if I just tried, even if it was going to be really hard.
And I also think that, that's the purpose behind the passion. The saying I have, purpose becomes passion when it gets personal.
Hmm.
For you, it was personal, and then you found your passion, which ultimately revealed your purpose. But at the same time, I think the fact that you weren't motivated by the one thing that most people are with startups, and that's money. If you can somehow um, find that thing that lights your fire and find a way to solve a problem that other people haven't been able to do. It doesn't mean there aren't problem solvers already out there. They're just not doing it the right way to
Hmm.
fix the problem.
Yeah.
And I think that goes in your favor, though, because the fact you came in fairly naive means you don't have those cognitive biases that a lot of people would have. I run into that in my situation because of the fact I'm older. So I tend to try to, my critic in my mind keeps reminding me, hey, Jeff, you shouldn't be, you're in a young person's world. You shouldn't be doing a startup at your age, but you can play that game. You can say, well, this is a male dominated world. You
Hmm.
know, I think we all can find like I tell my boys all the time, you can find reasons to do something or you can find reasons not to do something. Right. So I think being naive has helped you and I both,
Yeah, I think
you
you're
know,
absolutely right. People
and
tried to,
I don't mean naive to be negative. I mean naive just because it's so unknown. We don't know what we're really doing until we do it.
yeah, and I totally agree. When I was starting Perimeter, a lot of investors and, previous startup executives told me, you should really, like, you seem smart. You should try to do something that is actually achievable.
Yeah.
And this is just going to be so much harder than you can imagine. And I'm really glad that I didn't know because
Yeah.
in a world where I wouldn't have tried to do this, like, I would much rather live in the world where I do. So
Hmm.
I agree. I think that my naivete at that point and that kind of um, that belief that we'll be able to figure it out, even when a lot of data points to the contrary, I think
Hmm.
is absolutely necessary for making
Hmm.
changes that have otherwise not really been made for 200 years.
So one thing I wanted to talk to you about that I know my listeners and followers would have an interest in getting your thoughts on is, you know, I do a lot of talk with advocates that are pretty heavy in the mental health area of first responders. And at our expo we had back in May, I had a panel discussion which I moderated, and some of the comments that the police officers and the firemen, firewomen, fire people. I'm not sure what the correct
Firefighters.
term. Firefighters. Thank you.
Hmm.
I don't want to get canceled. But some of the stories they told me were just horrific. And then they
Yeah.
had to go home, and change clothes and put on their sweats and their t-shirt and sit down on the couch and watch TV if they have that opportunity. Sometimes they're called back to work again. But I'm like, the sacrifices that they make, we need to have programs and systems and processes to protect them, like you've come up with, to give them the ability to to go home and see their families, not just see them, but see them in a way where their frame of mind is good. The PTSD levels for first responders are through the roof compared to the normal mainstream jobs.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on kind of a little bit of a segue from what you specifically founded,
Mhm.
but what's your thoughts just overall with first responders and mental health, and where do you see the future of, say, things like PTSD and depression and alcoholism, and the suicide rates are higher as well. But
Mhm.
what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure when we were sitting next to each other on the plane if I brought up the work that I've been doing with my mom, who started a nonprofit specifically to help first responders proactively to mitigate the impacts of PTSD,
Mm,
because it's not really a question of if, it's a matter of when a first responder
right,
is going to be exposed to
right.
traumatic events on a very regular basis. And my work with her organization, First Responders Resiliency Inc. This is not, it's not my nonprofit, but I tend to go to as many of her conferences as possible, and it has been such an honor for me to be working in the public safety space and simultaneously able to attend these conferences where we're having incredibly real conversations about what the reality is for first responders. And it is, like you said, their suicide rates are through the roof. Their
Hmm.
organ cancer is drastically higher than it would be for a non first responder. And that's actually why my mom started this nonprofit in the first place, because she had organ cancer a few years ago.
Mm,
Originally, it was a terminal diagnosis, and the surgeon said to her, "Yeah, I see a lot of this in first responders." And she said, "What? You see a lot of what in first responders?" And he said, "Organ cancer." And
hmm.
so my mom ended up going on this in this and she got into this deep research to understand, like, what's going on with the physiological responses of our bodies to the stress that we as first responders are experiencing.
Hmm.
And she started with originally that research, and it just opened her eyes to how a lot of the stress, like you mentioned, it might happen on scene, and it doesn't, it still comes home with you unless you
Yeah.
learn how to discharge some of that energy, and learn to create practices in your life that help you not just mentally and emotionally process the trauma, but also physiologically process in a way that helps reduce the chances of disease. And my mom has this great quote, um, that I love when she says this. I just think it's so clear. She says that if the number one leading cause of disease and illness is stress, which it is,
Hmm.
then the number one thing you can do to reduce disease is reduce stress.
Hmm.
And so a lot of the tools and techniques that she works with first responders on are designed to help them basically transform that stress that they're exposed to and that trauma that they're exposed to, so that it's not having an impact on their lifespan and their relationships in a toxic way.
Yeah, it's. I think I saw the other day that first responders have 10 times the suicidal ideation. You know, um, and the rates for actually completing the act of suicide are substantially higher as well. So it's like it's all hands on deck. And so even though you and I have different organizations, and everyone watching this, it's in the space will have the same. No one's got the same organization. We're all trying to do the same ultimate goal, and that's either save lives or put people in a situation where their lives and their quality of life and their well-being is all enhanced.
Yeah.
you know so we had a very good conversation on ways that you and I both self-care.
Hmm.
And so you know I know I want to respect your privacy as well, so I'll share kind of some of the things that I'm comfortable on my end, and then you can jump in as you want. But I think for me, meditation was a big thing that we discussed, and kind of how I as a secular person, as somebody that's really never felt compelled to attach myself to some celestial being in time of need, or maybe as a reward. If I'm good, I go to heaven,
Hmm.
or some type of a thing to avoid punishment. If I'm good, I don't go to hell. I really struggled with, how do you become a passionate advocate for mental health if you don't have um, that belief structure? Yet I'm very spiritual. I think that's where you and I had about an hour conversation on peeling back the layers of spirituality. And so meditation's really helped me a lot. Mindfulness has helped me specifically with meditation. What's your thoughts on, maybe we can start with mindfulness, meditation, those type of things, and then where spirituality comes into helping you get through. Well, I think get through sounds bad. We don't want to survive. We want to thrive, right? We don't want to
Right.
just get through our day. We want to have amazing days.
Yeah.
So what are some things you do that helps with your self-care?
Yeah. So, meditation is definitely a big one for me, but the thing that has really changed my life from a mental health perspective is writing.
Mm.
And,
I
you
remember you
know,
talking about that.
yeah,
Yeah.
and one thing that really unlocked my ability to meditate more effectively is learning that having someone tell me that, it's not, if you have 1,000 thoughts a minute and you just recognize a thought and release it, then you're doing meditation correctly. I used to
Hmm.
think that meditation was about getting rid of your thoughts and not
Me
having
too.
thoughts.
Me
And
too.
so when
Or
I heard,
controlling them, right?
right, exactly. And
Yeah.
so when I learned that, oh, I'm having tons of thoughts, but I'm saying, oh, that's a thought, I'm going to let it go.
Mm.
That is, that means that you're not a bad meditator. Like, this is what meditation is for. So that really helped me learn to meditate. But before I learned that, the one place where I could really lose myself and get grounded after a couple pages of writing was this writing process that
Mm.
I started doing, not because I thought that journaling was suddenly a great idea. I started writing every day because I woke up every morning in a panic.
Mm.
I'd be sweating, my heart would be beating out of my chest, my eyes would open, and I was already just completely gone. And I needed a solution that could help me immediately as soon as I woke up. And somebody recommended that I put a journal next to my bed. I'd never journaled before, it's not really my thing, but put a journal next to my bed, and as soon as I wake up, start writing. And after a couple months, not only did that completely transform my anxiety and my panic in the morning, but it really unlocked a new level of spirituality for me that then enhanced my experience with meditation. And what I mean by that is, for me, I think spirituality, secular or not, can sometimes be um, kind of found, and not that, I mean, obviously spirituality is a huge topic, but
Yeah.
one of the like spiritual experiences that I often have is when I can kind of sink below, or like get away from like all of the noise and find this really deep place of gratitude. And
Mm.
when you're meditating and the stories and the noise, when you can release a lot of that, I think what's underneath for all of us is this peace and gratitude. And it's not a matter of, we don't need to add more things to our plate to find that kind of peace and freedom. I think it's more a matter of removing those things and then
Mm.
finding that place and releasing the stories that tell us that we're not enough, or we should be somewhere other than where we are, or that our
Mm.
experience is wrong, or XYZ, anything our brains can come up with. And so for me, it's been a very like symbiotic relationship between meditation and writing, because writing helps me recognize those stories in a way that's actually easier for me than just sitting with myself. If I write down the thoughts that are coming up, it's a lot easier for me to say, like, oh, I can reframe that. Like, I have a little bit of distance because
Yeah.
I'm here and this is the page.
I love that. I was listening to a podcast yesterday with Dr. Richard Schwartz, is the gentleman's name. It's on the Rich Rolls podcast, which I really like his podcast. And he was talking about how kind of exactly what you said, but Rich was asking him about the inner critic that we all have. Like, where does this come from? Why is this person inside of us? If there is a self, and that's a whole
Hmm.
different conversation on free will and all that. But it's like, this guy was saying, well, you got to remember your inner critic is a part of evolution that was there to give you safety, to protect you. But the problem is a lot of our inner critics are still stuck at, age 7, 8, 9, 10 years old.
Hmm.
Although our bodies are, biologically we're a certain age, but that inner critic's never grown up, and it
Fact.
hangs on to petty things. And I'm like, and this guy was talking about, not like we have multiple personalities. That's a whole different podcast. But he was talking more about if we can almost, like you said, reframing, or kind of use a little stoicism to kind of look at, that inner critic. We're not trying to silence the inner critic.
Hmm.
We're trying to get the inner critic to mature and grow up and be
Hmm.
more reflective to what we're going through today. And so I don't know if that makes any sense, but what I got from that was that there's elements of us that make us human:
Hmm.
anxiety, sadness, depression, things like that. And if we understand that inner critic can actually be an ally, be a source of strength, or a source of, hey, Jeff, hey, Bailey, maybe you ought to look at things this way. Maybe that person is giving you good advice. Don't be so stubborn. So I'm trying to look at all these voices in my head as actually trying to help me
Hmm.
survive and do better in my life, as opposed to holding me back, like trying to silence the inner critic. It's just a new
Yeah.
way to look at it. It's a new way to look at it, because I think it's part of our attraction is trying to silence everything, or to stop, numb the pain, they say, or time heals all wounds. And it's like, I think we talked on plane about, I'm not really convinced that that's what I want to do. I don't want the memories of my son and my wife to go away. Just forget about them, you know? So I'm not sure where I got off on that, but I think it was kind of looking at the meditation angle, and kind of, we talk to ourselves all day long, and we're always free to tell ourselves a different story about our past. It doesn't have to
Hmm.
be the tragic, unfortunate one.
Absolutely. And, I really actually resonate with this idea of there being different, not voices, not like,
Right.
different people in my head, but I think we can all relate to the idea of having, like, okay, I have an inner critic and I recognize that that's not me, you know?
Right.
But without meditation and without writing, the challenge is when you identify with that voice and you think that it is you,
Hmm.
it's even more painful. And what I learned about this type of therapy called internal family systems. And
that's the guy I just mentioned.
oh,
IFS.
amazing. Yeah, yeah.
IFS. That, I
And
mean, talk about odd. This is the way our conversation went on the plane. By the way, people watching this, is every time we brought up a topic, we're like, "Oh my God, that's exactly who Dr. Richard Schwartz." I think he's the founder of IFS.
no
I
way.
was just
So
I was thinking of the acronym in my head before you said it.
that
That's
is
what it is.
incredible. Yeah.
That is
And
hilarious, because we did not rehearse that.
wow, that's amazing. And I'm not surprised. But
No, not at all.
I discovered this. I don't know if it's his book actually that I read, but I read a book about
It's the
IFS.
multiplicity of the mind. That's the name of the podcast, and it's Dr. Richard Schwartz, and I'm pretty sure he's the founder of IFS. Anyway,
Uh,
go ahead.
Amazing. Well, I'd love to meet him, but anyway.
Mm.
So I discovered IFS and it completely transformed my relationship with myself because for the past few years, I have responded to my inner critic as something that I wanted to destroy. Like I
Right,
didn't
me
want
too.
to have an inner critic. Like I
Right.
just wanted to go away. And like I can even feel my body right now, like getting angry at
Yeah.
this part of me that will never let me
Mm.
catch a break.
Right.
And when I learned about internal family systems,
That's
the
amazing.
idea is that, we have that these different parts of ourselves that we can actually develop a positive relationship, a healthy, nourishing relationship to those parts by communicating with them, by like loving them,
Mm.
and that they then when they are freed by our like love and attention, the inner critic has tons of skills like you mentioned that could be
Yeah.
helpful. So for
Right.
me, my quote unquote inner critic, when I'm writing and I'm not, you know, really paying attention and taking the time to respond to the inner critic is always saying, "You suck. Your writing sucks. This is so
Mm-hmm.
boring. None of this
Mm-hmm.
matters. Why are you writing? Please stop." Right? That's what
Mm-hmm.
the inner critic wants me not to write and would be thrilled if I just, if no one ever read anything that I wrote, right? If I
Yeah.
was born with potential and I died with potential.
Right.
And what I have realized through IFS is, well, that inner critic is the same part of me that helps me after the fact with sentence construction and making sure
Yeah.
that things flow and, responds to grammar and looks for little mistakes that might trip up, my reader, even if that reader is just myself. And so I realized like, oh, I don't want to actually destroy my inner critic. I want to change our relationship and
Perfect.
practice
Yep.
practice inviting my inner critic to, like, yeah, you can try to get me to stop writing. That's fine. Or I'll just write for now. And then after, I would love like to invite that part of me in to give me the feedback that I need. And the way
I
that
have
I've
so many
done
questions.
that
I have so many questions for you on this topic.
Well, I'd love to hear them. Let me just give you this tiny example that has helped me in meditation because the idea of IFS it's big. There's a lot that you can do, but how can we use some of these concepts in just 30 seconds with ourselves when we feel like we're kind of under attack by, let's say, the inner critic? One thing that I love to imagine when I'm meditating, even if it's just for a minute, is when I feel like I'm overwhelmed by a voice that says like I'm not enough, I suck, etc., etc. I imagine having a little pink spray bottle that's
Huh.
like love foam. I know this is silly, but this really helps me. I imagine it's love foam. And instead of trying to strangle that part of me in my mind and get it to stop talking while I'm trying to meditate, instead I imagine that I have a spray bottle of love and I just squirt it.
Hmm.
I'm just
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm not enough. Like, you sucked. Like, stop
Yeah.
writing. And I'm like, oh,
Right.
it's like, oh, let me just spray you with love. Can you imagine getting sprayed in your face with like pink foam and not laughing? Like, it'd be the
That's
silliest thing.
yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it always reminds me, like, oh, I don't have to take this seriously. And
Hmm.
what this part of me needs is my love, not my rejection.
I mean, that's so awesome the way that you've thought of that in your mind because I kind of play similar. I've never thought of pink love foam, but um,
I can't believe I said
um,
that out loud.
yeah, no, I love it. But I have that. I have it similar with grief for me.
Mhm.
That's my, you know, uh, if I could be God for a day, if there is such a thing, I would expunge that element of my life. But at the same time, when I feel grief coming, I don't fight it anymore. I think I told you in the plane, I kind of think of it as like my mental health workout, like going to the gym. It's like it's necessary for me not to become, you know, it sounds counterintuitive, but we really don't want to get rid of all these emotions
No.
because then we're going to be that AI that we dread. We're going to be that artificial intelligence that we all think is going to take over humanity. And we'll become that robotic sentient if we get away from having sadness and fear and anxiety and depression. Those are all things that keep us human. We just want to keep the lifespan of them very minimal, right?
Mhm.
But I think that IFS is something. I'm going to get the guy's book. I'm going to listen to some more podcasts with him on it because that's just crazy that you brought that up because I literally just listened to that yesterday. I was driving in my car and I was listening to the podcast and I was driving, which I write down. I mean, I got notes everywhere. I got a little bit of, but my problem is I don't go back and read them. That's the problem. I have notes and notes and notes that I've never read, but I
Well,
think
you're
it's something about just getting it in writing. I know I can always go back and read it later. I just always write down more things and I always fall behind on trying to read them. So I gave up on trying to read all my notes.
Yeah, I'm the exact same way. I'm constantly writing, even just right here. I've got one notebook, I've got a second notebook, I've got three by
Well,
five
you showed me
cards.
one on the plane and
Right.
it was awesome. It was just like if someone could like tap your brain and just pull words and sentences out
Hmm.
randomly, that's what your notebook was. And there's something about journaling, and it's probably not talked about, especially with kids' mental health. I mean, I think with our app geared towards Gen Z, our Brighten app, if there's a way that we could get kids to journal more. So you
Hmm.
mentioned when you get up in the morning, you start writing. I have to ask you, are you writing your dreams? Are you writing just whatever the heck's in your mind? Because I know when I did that for a while, I'm happy I did, because by 10 minutes of being awake, I already forgot what I dreamt about. I forgot about even the fear or anxiety I had when I woke up. So what are you writing about when you get up in
Yeah.
the morning? What's some of the things that, you don't have to share the details, but like what type of things are you writing about?
Yeah, so I'm actually not usually writing about my dreams unless I had a dream that really, really hit me in a way that I
Right.
want to unpack later. But I have written down my dreams before, and I've ended up getting just lost in the like, what could this mean and what could this mean? I think there's a
Yeah.
lot of
Because
value to
dreams
that.
can be real subjective too.
Exactly. And so I think what has been so helpful for me is waking up and just writing whatever the story is. So if wake up and I'm like, I'm overwhelmed by XYZ, the quota that I have for myself with writing, and I got this from a book called The Artist's Way, but my quota is 3 pages. And so I'm
Mm.
committed to writing 3 pages, even though I don't feel like writing 3 pages. And I almost never feel like writing 3 pages. The
And this is
first
every
page,
morning. This is
mhm,
every morning, 3 pages in the
it
morning.
for the first year it was mostly every morning. Now I want to give myself a little bit more time, and so I either write after work, or I write when I'm feeling a lot of stress, because my body has learned if I'm really anxious and I start writing, within about 10 minutes I'm going to feel not just less stressed. I'm going to feel grounded and clear about what I'm doing, why I'm here, what my goal is, etc. And I think the reason for that is when you have a quota like 3 pages, for me at least, the first page and a half or 2 pages is pretty ranty. It's rambling. I'm like unpacking what I'm concerned about for the
Yep.
day. But as I get to that last page, and I think this is why the artist's way like suggests this quota of pages, by the time I get to that last page, something clicks for me. And I remember, no matter what I'm overwhelmed by, let's say it's at work, if I'm overwhelmed by, I end up coming back to this reframing that helps me realize, like, remember, you're doing this, you're working on this because, it kind of brings back my why. It's like because you really care about this thing. And honestly, you love the experience, like you love learning. And I've worked with an executive coach named Danny for a little while, and every time I have a challenge, he's like, "Oh, this is awesome. You love challenges." And I
Yeah.
kind of have that same framing in my
Yep.
book. And at first, it was annoying. It's like, darn it,
Right.
how could I forget? I waited a week to bring this challenge to him.
Right.
And the first thing he says is, "Awesome, you love challenges." And I'm like,
Right.
dang it, that's all I needed to say. And it would have been
Yeah.
like, reframe. And you brought up stoicism earlier. It's kind of,
Hmm.
cognitive behavioral therapy or
Yeah.
stoicism, like there's, they're very intertwined. And there's this idea that it's not the events of our life that disturb us. It's the interpretation and the reinterpretation of those events
Mm.
constantly over and over.
Yep.
And so taking the time to recognize what story are you telling yourself, and then give yourself enough space to choose a new story helps me at least create that repetition of saying, I'm choosing a new story. And even if it takes time to integrate, then still over time, eventually you will see that you're more likely to live this feeling in this story that I love what I'm doing. I'm grateful to be here. I see the reasons. I'm able to feel gratitude for some of the most painful things in my life. I don't wish that they happened, but I can see how I am transformed by having to
Mm.
go through these dark periods. And there's always something that you can find in there to be grateful for. But sometimes it takes getting outside of yourself to find those things. And I think that's what writing can help you do. It's certainly had it certainly had that in my life.
Yeah, I'm big in the recovery side of mental health. So people who've, stopped drinking or whatever, and they always say the path to recovery is different for everybody.
Yeah.
And I think the road to improving your well-being in your life is different for everybody. And so there are people that just can't meditate. They just can't tell themselves that story to be the observer, to be the witness, not the judge and jury, which
Mhm.
is where the conflict is with meditation. Oh, Jeff, I sat down and I just couldn't stop thinking. I'm like, well, you're judging that. You're judging the fact you couldn't stop thinking.
Mhm.
And I fought that for about a year, to be honest with you. And I didn't start meditating until after Seth died, um, because I went with attention deficit. I had to try to figure out a way to. I don't know. I read about it. I was curious. I'm a very curious person. A lot of recently, some of the things I've tried that um, I'm just not comfortable talking about yet on a
Mhm.
podcast. You and I talked
Yeah.
about it on the plane.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm not comfortable yet. And I will. I think I'll dedicate a whole podcast to just like a solo podcast where I'll talk about this experience that I had and how it was life changing for me. But
Mhm.
I think that's what makes hope and optimism tangible is this quest to always improve.
Yeah.
And you talked about um, in a way like I feel like I'm a glutton for punishment sometimes because I put myself in situations where failure is more likely than success, like
Mhm.
constantly. And I always ask myself, I could have just not started this startup. I could have just taken the money and went to the Caribbean and be scuba diving every day and golfing with friends. I'm just not wired that way, and at least
Yeah.
not at this age. Not at this age. Maybe I will be at 10 more years, but and so I always put myself in these positions where people are like, "Why are you doing this, Jeff?" What and I can't answer that sometimes. I don't know if I'm just addicted to being a risk taker. Now I'm older, it's not physical risk taking. When I was younger, maybe it was a little more physical stuff. Now it's more financial risks that I take, which probably don't make any sense as a retired financial advisor. I wouldn't be telling somebody my age to be doing these things, but I just kind of like you, I always feel like I need to challenge myself. And, I'm sure as you go through your different decades of your life, you'll accomplish certain things, but you're going to say, there's more. There's
Mhm.
always something more, to be learning or to be experiencing or to be embracing or, being philanthropic about. There's so many different things to be involved in that makes life worth living. And that's where you look back at the suicide issue we have in this country. And I have to think that the majority of people that decided to end their life, if they had a chance to redo, they wouldn't, you know,
Mhm.
it's just that moment of emptiness and lack of, hopelessness, you know, that they do that. And I've been there. I told you on the plane. I mean, it was that Christmas after my wife died. I was at peace of ending my life. And man, was that a horrific moment to have that thought
Mhm.
pop in my head. And I'm like, this isn't my thought. I've never had this thought before. Why would it show up now, years after this happened? So one thing I was going to ask you about is what's your thoughts on expectations that we have and then preparing for the inevitability of pain in our lives that is unavoidable.
Mhm.
Suffering's a choice. Pain is unavoidable. I think I got that from Viktor Frankl. He actually said suffering is my opportunity, and I kind of rephrased it. But so I don't know what you want to take out of what I just said. Those are all little bits of comments I made, but it keeps going. I keep getting compelled to pull back into what can I do to be an advocate to improve people's lives, and um, I'm curious if you have other options that you use other than meditation. I know you're very heavy into your diet,
Mhm.
exercise. How important does diet, exercise, and like sleep come into play for optimal mental health?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much we can unpack in those questions, and but first, I just want to say, I'm so grateful that you shared so much with me on the plane, and that you share so much of your story in an environment like this, because I think most of life is lived by people who don't really get to hear. about the biggest challenges that people face around them. And I
Hmm.
know, if you look at Silicon Valley founders, oftentimes you see some of the press, and it seems,
Hmm.
kind of glitzy and exciting, but
Hmm.
it is really remarkable, like how many of how many founders are really struggling with
Yeah.
suicidal ideation
Yep.
and getting so wrapped up in their company that the idea of their company failing is like a personal it it's not just a personal failure. It's like me, if my company fails, like my entire identity is wrapped up in it, and like I am a
Yeah.
failure.
I
And if
let
I
down so
couldn't.
many potential people I could have helped had it succeeded.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that one of the first steps to being able to address and respond and heal some of these experiences is, one, just being able to be honest and talk about them. And I think
Hmm.
for you and I, we I think we both cried on the plane,
Yep.
because we just went there, and
Yeah.
I when I meet, somebody like you who's just willing to have a really deep conversation, I think of you as like a scuba diver. It's like we're
Mm.
not snorkeling, we're not just like, we're not talking about the weather up at the surface. It's like, how deep do you
Right.
want to go right now? Because like I'll go
Yep.
there with you.
Right.
Most of
Yep.
us don't really have people like that who will go there with us.
Do you think you can be too vulnerable, Bailey? I mean, do you think it's do you think there's a I don't, and I mean that two ways. One, the person listening to you could say, "Wow, this is I don't need to know all this," or do you think by being vulnerable all the time, you just keep reliving those painful memories?
Well, I think that in conversation, uh, in my opinion, like a healthy conversation involves mutual respect.
Hmm.
And I think having respect for the person that you're talking to is a matter of checking in with yourself. You don't have to ask them necessarily in conversation, but kind of just checking in and seeing, like, okay, is this person like feeling uncomfortable with how deep
Hmm.
this conversation has gone, with how
Hmm.
like vulnerable this conversation is? And if so, like let's go back up. It's like it's not our jobs in conversation to like, unpack our deepest
Right.
secrets and our most, traumatic experiences with someone who isn't ready to go there. But I think
Hmm.
as long as we're checking in, when we're able to be really vulnerable like that and someone is willing to go there with us, I think it can be healing for both parties.
I do
And
too.
I think that when it comes to reliving trauma, and I am by no means an expert on this, but I think that when you're reliving something and you're sharing a story, I think you have an opportunity, even just for yourself, as you bring that up, to choose, like, am I looking at this and like giving myself, I'm thinking back to that like love foam again.
Yeah.
As I'm going into this place and reliving this experience, am I like giving myself the love that I need to like process this? Like you said
Hmm.
earlier, it's withholding the information, the not information, it's withholding the emotion and like trying to keep ourselves from like crying, for example,
Yeah.
that
Right.
like really is uncomfortable. Once we
Hmm.
actually cry and process the emotion, nobody feels worse after they cry. Like
Right.
when we
Yep.
cry, we release hormones that help us like like feel
Right.
more grounded and at peace. And so those emotions are a cycle. And if
Hmm.
you get really vulnerable and that helps you process your emotions, then I can see how, like, oh, is it a negative thing? Only if your idea of an emotion being negative is that it's a painful emotion. But if
Right.
you recognize or you interpret or you frame emotions as being a cycle that we go through as part of, our human experience of
Right.
having a brain with emotional capacity,
Right.
then it can be seen as a gift. It's like,
Mm.
oh wow, I'm able to experience so much. And even though it's painful right now and I have to like process through it and like come to tears, etc.,
Yeah.
that's actually why I'm here. Like I'm here to have these moments, and I think a lot of us are really starving for connection. And I think
Yeah.
by being vulnerable, we are able to meet someone at a place that's really different from where many of us live, which is online and social media, seeing the
Hmm.
good things. I think seeing the challenges helps us to really relate to people on a more human level.
Very beautifully well put. And the way you articulated that, I'm thinking in my own mind about this concept, and maybe it's the IFS, the individual. Again, going back to that, it's like we're all equipped with these survival instincts inside of us, just through many years of evolution. The strongest attributes survive, right? Strong cells survive. So we're accumulation of our strongest abilities that have survived over the years. So we all have it inside of us. It's just that it hasn't been nurtured correctly. Maybe it was slightly damaged as a child. Maybe you were abused. Maybe you were neglected, and so that thing inside of you, that's that survival skill, got a little bit off track, and now needs to be recalibrated. And I think things like a podcast I do, I'm meeting new people every day, and I'm really intentionally focused on avoiding the echo chamber concept, where it's like you and I sit here and we talk about something and we both validate each other and we pat each other on the back, and then I go to the next person, do the same thing. I think one of the problems with mental health is that we are very much focused on that. Is that, hey, I gave my son Adderall, so I just want to go find other parents that gave their kids Adderall and just convince myself that was the right decision. Or my son died from fentanyl, so now I'm just anti-fentanyl. I'm going to find 100 parents that lost their kids, and we're going to go protest. And it's like it's very tempting to do that throughout life. But I really like to just find people that maybe a combination of things that I enjoy, and then maybe some things I've not been exposed to, some new alternatives. Because to think that we've conquered the tools to build that toolbox of, or the arrows in the quiver, to think we found all the arrows in the quiver to perfect mental health, it's just comical to think that, we have so much further to go than how far we've gone.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of some of those arrows in the quiver, I really
Mm-hmm.
love that analogy. And a minute ago, you brought up things like sleep and diet
Yeah.
and exercise.
Yep.
And I feel like in terms of some of those quivers and some of those tools that we can use, sometimes it's easy to get to focus on anything other than some of our fundamental basic human needs.
Mm-hmm.
And I know for me, part of my mental health journey has looked like prioritizing my sleep, my diet, my movement in a way that I used to say, like, those are nice to haves. Like, especially a lot of founders, we kind of pride ourselves on being able to work more than anybody else. And
Yeah.
so that means, not sleeping, not giving
Yep.
ourselves time outside, not
Right.
eating regular
Right.
healthy meals. Like,
Yep.
I don't know if you've heard of Soylent, but there was a time where like I was basically drinking my meals instead of making time to actually sit down and like eat or
Yep.
cook. Like that was such a
Yep.
luxury I told myself I couldn't have. But it's amazing how sometimes, especially for those of us who have attention deficit,
Yeah.
being able to do things like give ourselves time outside to engage in the types of activities that help us get into flow. The flow state activities are another place where your mind naturally, like the like anxiety, the story in your mind naturally kind of gets flushed out, because when you're doing something that creates that in the zone experience, that flow
Yeah.
state, whether you get that by skateboarding or
Right.
painting or playing music, like whatever that thing is, the way that our brains respond and like create that flow state experience flushes out anxiety, because it focuses, when you're in flow, your mind is completely focused on the present. And
Mm.
since anxiety is usually worrying about the future, what could go wrong, and
Yep.
depression is so often tied to ruminating on the past and what
Yep.
has happened, what has gone wrong,
Mm-hmm.
those are not present tense experiences, right? It's either about future or past, which
Right.
means that when you're totally in the present, those experiences and that chatter gets flushed out of your system because you're so focused on this moment. And it's
That's so
it's
true.
been
Yeah.
yeah, and it's amazing how much, when we talk about mental health, we don't recognize like our bodies have so much capacity to transform our experience.
Mm-hmm.
Going for me, like going a certain amount of time without like good sleep, sometimes
Mm-hmm.
that's the first answer. Like, okay, number one, are you getting 8 hours of sleep?
Mm-hmm.
Number two, are you eating enough and regularly? For a long time, I
Yeah.
wasn't.
Yeah.
And three, am I moving my body, getting outside in a way that produces endorphins that naturally like give me a high that lasts for a
Mm-hmm.
long time, It's like
Mm-hmm.
we forget that, getting outside or working out, etc., like it might seem like a drag at the beginning, but everyone feels better after a workout, like your body is
100%.
like
Yep.
awesome, like this is
Yep.
great. And it's amazing how often we look for solutions outside of our most basic human needs. And I was thinking about this when you and I were on the plane, because the reason, like the first thing you said to me is you commented on my conversation with the flight attendant,
That's right.
because
I was
I
so
was going
impressed.
I was about to, it looked like I was going to miss my flight. I'd had a very, very long delay.
I forgot
And
about that. That's exactly. I'm like, oh my God, she's so calm. And you're so nice to the lady. And you're like, everyone else is wigging out and trying to get in line. And you were just so, and I'm like, I want to talk to her because there's
Mhm,
something about her that's got this Zen thing going, and I could just irradiate it off you. And honest to God, that was where I knew I had to ask you some questions on the plane, because that's atypical today. We just see everyone yelling and screaming and cell phones out, and they want to post how mad, how
mhm.
rude the flight attendant was. And you were just like, you were just a fresh, a breath of fresh air
Thank you.
on a normal situation where airlines get so much negative press.
Thank you. And I really appreciate that. And at the moment, when you first said, like, wow, that was maybe like the calmest
Yeah.
interaction I've ever seen between a flight attendant and a
Ever.
passenger who's going to miss her
Ever.
connecting flight.
Yep.
And I remember, like, in my head thinking, like, yeah, well, I just ate lunch, so I'm not panicking right now. And
I'm
it's
not
funny,
always
like,
like this. He caught me at a good moment.
well, no, it was a reminder for me that, oh, right, when I meet my basic human needs, now I don't think I've ever, yelled at a flight attendant before, like, oh
Right.
gosh, I don't think
Right.
that's really in my character. But, I did notice that there wasn't any, like, when you were like, oh, wow, that was really calm. It's like, I wasn't trying to be calm. I was
Right.
just feeling really secure. And I had this
Right.
moment where I realized, how interesting that when I meet my needs, and I was like, I'm going to get food before the plane, even though I know that I could get a meal 2 hours from now. And I remember
Right.
realizing, oh, in the past, I might not have done that for myself.
Hmm.
In the past, I might have said, like, oh, I got to get some stuff done, so I'll wait to eat later. And just meeting some of our most basic human needs can help us like stay grounded
Hmm.
in those really even just like frustrating times.
Yeah.
And I remember getting off the plane, and of course I did miss my connecting flight, and I did get stuck in Denver that night.
Yeah.
And after meeting you, I was like, wow, that was so meant to be. And I'm so
Hmm.
grateful if it took me missing my connection to have that conversation with the flight attendant to give you an opportunity to start talking to me, then it was
Hmm.
so worthwhile. And we never know when something that we're walking into that might seem really frustrating is
Yeah.
actually closing a door and opening a door
Yeah.
that might be even better than
Yeah.
getting to Detroit on time.
Yeah, I mean, man, there's just so much that people watching this I hope they get from this, because what I got from that random chance encounter on the airplane is that there's a lot more Jeff Johnstons and Bailey Farrens out there that are seated next to planes that for some reason don't engage in conversation, and they miss these opportunities to have a friend now, have somebody that I could talk to on the startup world if I'm struggling or down. Like, hey, give me a few things to focus on. You've already said a few things today that you know um, that I'm now thinking, okay, I like that idea, like small wins. Like, what can I do today to win the day? I get thinking about my startup and the exit strategy. And it's like I get so damn far ahead of myself that if I don't just do 4 or 5 little things today, then I'll never get to that.
Yeah.
that anxiety world that I'm creating that doesn't exist, right? That day doesn't exist. I'm creating that day in my mind, and I'm pinning anxiety to it.
Yeah.
I don't have to do that. I mean, that's a choice. That's a conscious choice, right?
Yeah, and I love this idea of small wins because I think as as anyone working on a project where there's some idea of success in the future, it's easy to be so focused on that, that future situation that you have to get to that we don't recognize that like once I know what needs to happen and I've like
Hmm.
reverse engineered, goals to know what I
Yeah.
have to achieve to get there, you don't need to keep living over there. For me, it has been so nourishing to give myself an opportunity to see each day as being like successful. If I'm, one, like, yes, I have goals that I'd like to accomplish, but I also feel successful every day when I have something that I know, like, I'm looking forward to this thing tonight. I'm going to go play this sport, or I'm going to go give myself time to do XYZ thing. And
Hmm.
at the end of the day, when I go to sleep, like, I feel like it was successful regardless of regardless of what I actually did, when I have those small wins and I
Yeah.
let like each day be a
Huh.
valuable piece of my experience, then it doesn't matter like how close I am to that far thing because at the end of the day, even if you achieve that big goal, that huge exit at the end of your startup, that doesn't actually change you.
Good
But the
point.
process
Yep.
on your way to achieving that goal transforms you. And
Bingo.
you're always
Yep.
going to be changing.
That's
And so do you want to be changing in a way that gets you closer to this feeling of like peace and fulfillment, or do
yeah.
you want to be changing in a way that turns you into this like goal seeking, rat race
Yeah.
animal that like needs
Right.
to be validated by achieving certain goals in order to feel like you matter for 3 seconds,
Hmm.
and I think that like you said earlier, like we're kind of, some of us are gluttons for punishment. Like, why do we do
Yeah.
this? Why do we take on the hard thing? I think everyone has a certain capacity that they need to like be exercising. Like, I think if you and I went and moved to, different tropical islands and were just scuba
Hmm.
diving every day, for some people that would work. But I think
Yeah.
you and I would go a little nuts. And I heard this idea once
For a
that,
little while, I could
yeah,
do that for a while. I love
no, no,
scuba
no.
diving, so
Yeah.
yeah.
But like for eventually we'd like, we'd start chewing on the couch.
Yeah.
And
Right.
I think that when you have like, you and I talked a lot about attention deficit on
Yeah.
the plane. And,
Yeah.
when you have like so much moving and you have, tons of thoughts and, tons of capacity to just be like, churning through things,
Hmm.
sometimes it feels really good to have a project that you can sink yourself into. And
Yeah.
so
I
it's no
agree.
surprise that we take on a lot. And
Right.
sometimes I think a lot of people don't really see themselves as qualified to start a
Hmm.
company.
Hmm.
And in part, it's because, I mean, no one really is qualified to start a company because you have to learn so much on the fly. You qualify yourself along the
I
way.
was gonna say if you're qualified, you waited too long.
Exactly, exactly. And, I think a lot of people don't try to start things because they think, like, I'm not qualified.
Right.
When really, just the fact that you have that drive to solve a certain problem or to build a certain solution means that,
Yeah.
like, that's the most important qualification you could have
Mm.
is this obsession with a certain thing, a certain
Hmm.
idea, a certain problem, a certain solution, a certain topic, etc. And I think the more we take care of ourselves and focus on these small wins and,
Hmm.
have pride in what we're doing, the more likely we're going to be to allow ourselves to try that thing that we've been dreaming of. And once we do, it can be a really beautiful outlet for us
Yeah.
to, take all of that like angst that we might have and
Right.
pour it into something that ends up feeling incredibly fulfilling during
You
and after.
you said small wins a few times, and I want to just ask your thoughts on this. And I'm going to use a metaphor or an analogy about with golf because when my son golfed competitively as a child, I used to tell him, when you get that birdie chance. I don't know if you're familiar with all the golf jargon, but if you get a birdie, that's like you're banking a small win,
Hmm.
because now you get a bogey in the next hole, your birdie offsets that. And
Hmm.
so if you go through life thinking I need to bank small wins like birdies in golf, that I can have that double bogey, I can have that triple bogey, but it doesn't destroy my round because I had lots of birdies. So I
Hmm.
always told Ian, because kids have a triple bogey on a hole and their round's over, but they could have four birdies preceding that triple bogey, but all they're going to think about is the one bad hole. But you had four really good holes. And it's that recency bias that we all have as a cognitive bias, is that the most recent things that happen to us we weight more emotion to those things.
Hmm.
And so I think with, like, for golf or Ian, I was trying to tell him, as you go through life, little wins are like birdies.
Yeah.
You know, little wins are like an eagle. That they're great when they happen, and it's a positive thing you can put in the bank. And now down the road, something happens. Well, go back to that birdie and remember that hole, because that was a positive thing. So I think it's all about taking two or three, four steps forward, maybe one or two, three steps back. And those steps back could be anything. It could be addiction to alcohol, could be, the grief of that's my son and my wife back there. Could be the grief of losing two people you care about, could be a failure in a business, could be a failure in a marriage. Whatever that is, those steps back need to be offset with little wins, right?
Hmm.
Because if you just have steps back and you never get the wins and you're only waiting for the big win, you're going to be a really miserable person.
Yeah, absolutely. And when sometimes we get to that big win and we hope that that's going to change us. But I think many of
What, you're
us are
saying it
probably
doesn't? I don't think,
I
I don't, for me, I don't think it has. I've had big wins in my life and they tend to go away quick and I want to do another one.
exactly. I think, leading up to it, we think, well, that is going to be the thing that
Right.
finally changes me. And if
Right.
that's the story that we tell ourselves, I'll wait until
Mm-hmm.
that thing to be changed, then we miss the opportunity of every small step that is
Enjoying them.
actually an opportunity for change
Yeah.
every step of the way. And by the time you get to that goal, there's another goal beyond it. And I think, with startups, for example, and people do startups in lots of different ways.
Right.
But for me, it's like, yes, I do, obviously I'm very cognizant of the financial opportunity relating to the work that we're doing. But the more exciting thing to me is kind of shooting past that and reaching that, like, that opportunity to have real impact
Yeah.
in a space that is so personal to me.
Right.
And and also, like, I've realized over the past couple of years that another goal of mine is through this process to, like, let this process transform me. It kind of
Absolutely.
feels like I really love, not just because of my company, but I love fire metaphors. I
Mm.
love the idea of, like, fire purifying metals
Hmm.
and feeling like I walk through these fires and they're not comfortable. And the very fact of them being uncomfortable is how I know that there are opportunities for me to be transformed in
Hmm.
some way. And when things like come up and you're like uncomfortable and you're growing and you feel vulnerable and it feels like an edge, it's like awesome. That
Yeah.
is an opportunity for the change that
Right.
you really seek. And if you look for opportunities to be uncomfortable as your, like, area for transformation, micro transformations,
Mm-hmm.
then that big goal out there, like, you're moving towards it and that's really exciting. But whether or not you get there, and if you do, you actually bring all of this other transformation with you. Because
Hmm.
that goal, achieving it, you want to make $10 million, you want to make $100 million, you want to make $10, whatever. Once you have it, it doesn't change you.
No.
And what we really, I think, yearn for is not just, we don't just want money in the bank. I have met a lot of very successful founders who are not happy people, who've made it. They are
Sure.
not happy people.
Right.
And I think that if you remember that, like, oh, my goal beyond financial success is to feel deeply fulfilled by the work that I'm doing and
Mm-hmm.
fulfilled in the process that I'm creating, then you're winning at every stage.
Hmm.
of your work, of your company. And I think when we go to sleep or when we wake up, that's what really matters, is that we're giving ourselves the time to feel fulfilled along the way. And if you're only waiting for one big win before you celebrate your accomplishments and yourself for even trying, you've missed an opportunity to love your experience. And I I think that the experience that you're having matters so much for you when you look back at the end of your life. Like,
Hmm.
that's what you're going to look back on. You're going to feel the victories, sure, but you're going to look back on what kind of experience you had and if it was super meaningful. And that's where you're going to tell stories.
Yeah, the wisdom comes in talking to people on their deathbed, and then you really can encapsulate what life's all about right there
Yeah.
in that moment. When they have a minute to live or whatever, if you have the opportunity to know when you're going to die, you just don't talk about the nicest car you ever had. You don't
Yeah.
talk about the best vacation you ever went on, like, some fancy place, but you talk about the people you were with on those vacations. And you talk a lot about regret. I mean,
Hmm.
a lot of older people, there was a book out a while ago where they interviewed 100, could have been 100 centurions. I'm not sure what the book was, but it was all, and all the wisdom in the book was unbelievable, but it was just so simple. It was
Hmm.
like, what do you most remember about your life? And it was all the things that you would think, time with family and friends, and none of it was money.
Hmm.
And then what do you regret the most? And that's where a lot of times you saw things like how much I worked, my pursuit of success. There's something about this that we need to be
Yeah.
learning from. There really is. And so I tell you what, this has been great. I mean, I normally my podcasts are about an hour, so you're going to break the record, which is fine. I have to ask you this question because I think it's
Yeah.
an opportunity. You are a role model for young women. And do you feel a sense of obligation now that I'm not going to say made it, because I know in your mind you're never going to really truly make it like me. I don't think I'm ever going to ever make it.
Yeah.
But do you feel an obligation? Do you feel honored? Do you feel humbled? I mean, what word comes to mind being a young, successful founder CEO woman in today's, male dominated, almost every, my financial services industry was, 92% men, but the
Hmm.
8% of women that were in it, they were rock stars. I mean, they were ridiculous. And do you
Yeah.
feel that sense of obligation, or do you just kind of go along saying, nah, I don't want to overthink this too much. I'm just Bailey Farren. I'm just working
Hmm.
hard and I'm enjoying life.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always felt that sense of obligation, and it hasn't been tied to whether or not I've been successful. It's been more tied to the situation that I'm in. And even like, I remember in school feeling like, okay, if I'm going to be one of the only women in this science class or in this tech class, I don't just feel like I'm working hard for myself. I feel sometimes like I'm working hard on behalf, like it's not, I'm not saying this is right, but kind of like as the one woman in the room, like
Yeah,
I'm showing up for women right now and
absolutely.
for future women who try to do this. And I remember that when I first joined my startup accelerator, they took a bet on me. I was a young woman, only 2% of venture investments, startup investments go to female founders. And so I was a young woman, I was 22, I
Mm.
was fresh out of college. When we got into the accelerator, I actually hadn't yet graduated. And we were doing this business that was like impossible to people. Like, what?
Hmm.
GovTech, public safety? Like, what are you talking about? And one thing that has really pushed me to keep going when things get really hard, in addition to my why with the business, is knowing that if I'm successful, then people like my startup accelerator and the investors who took a chance on me, they're more likely to take a chance on the next
Yeah.
young female college student
Yep.
doing something that sounds ludicrous, but might have a huge positive impact if it's successful. And so if I don't, our recency bias, like you said, will kick
Yeah.
in and people will be less likely. They might say to themselves unconsciously, we already tried investing in a young college student
Yeah.
before and it didn't work. And
Yep.
so one, I do feel that obligation, but it's not a burden.
Right.
Instead, it feels like now I've always, wanted to show up and, and be one of the most hardworking people in the room, sometimes on behalf of the women who aren't in that room.
Right.
And now that I've had so many of those opportunities to learn skills and tools that are drastically improving my experience now, both at work and in my life as, my experience as just being a founder. Now I'm just really excited to give back to, even though I'm still young, the next generation of,
Right.
especially young women who are asking themselves maybe for the first time, like, could I actually do something about this? And
Well,
that question, I hope that if anyone meets me or sees me or hears me talk or anything like that, I hope that they feel encouraged to try something that they don't feel qualified to do because they were able to see someone else who was objectively not qualified.
well,
Go for it.
can't I can't begin to tell you how needed people like you are for young women because the statistics for self-harm, depression, isolation, body dysmorphia for young women today is the highest it's ever been. Just things from cutting to anorexia, um, and it's magnified through social media, specifically TikTok and those outlets, those platforms where young women just are seeing every other young woman looking beautiful, the perfect body frame, the perfect TikToks. And I think, and I know this because I've seen the demographics, but young teenage women today, it's the hardest environment they've ever grown up in. And I'm not saying
Mm,
young teenage boys don't have it hard too, they do, but I think it's specifically hard today on young women.
yeah.
Um, and I'm cognizant of that as we build out our mental health app, as I'm building out Brighton. I have to keep in consideration that there's going to be a lot of young women that download this app that are looking for help, a guidance, a roadmap, guide rails, maybe, whatever metaphor you want to use, that are going to be different from young men, young boys. I mean, the different types of anxiety, the different types of depression, or even reasons why they take their own lives are different quite often.
Yeah.
So I applaud the timing. You had nothing to do with the timing of your age, but I mean the fact that you are a young female CEO, breaking that glass ceiling that, I think it's awesome. We need more people. That's one of the reasons why I really felt I needed to get you on the show is that, you know, you're a breath of fresh air into a world that is so negative and so down and so critical of other people. And, you talked about something about that inner critic. And I want to end this with this idea that inner critic's goal is like a negative friend. Their goal is to drag you down to their level.
Hmm.
Their goal isn't to pull you up. Their goal is to make you feel like them. Well, that's where social media is today with young people, is that it wants to pull them down. It's the way it's designed with the algorithms and the way that uh, they addict young minds
Yeah.
with social media. So it's like I'm so honored to have you on the show because, like I said, you bring just a whole different set of a lens to this. For me, it's mental health. For you, it's structuring first responders so they can be safely taking care of other people and themselves in the
Hmm.
most expedited manner. Right.
Yeah.
That's kind of in a nutshell what your business model is.
Yeah.
Um, well, how can people reach you? I know I'm gonna have a lot of people ask me about you. What's the easiest way? I mean, do you speak? I mean, do you travel and speak at conferences? And I know people
Yeah.
are going to want to get you on podcasts. And again, I'm so honored to have this opportunity. To be honest with you, Bailey, it's been great, and I hope or I'm confident that you and I'll find ways to collaborate down the road at some capacity. Um, ultimately, our mission's the same, and that's to help people improve their lives, whatever way that we can. But how do people reach you? What's the easiest way to be in contact with you? And then we'll end it
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I'll answer the question about speaking first. Yes,
Yeah.
so more recently, I speak at a lot of first responders resiliency conferences, but I've also recently spoken at Women Impact Tech Conference, and I hope to do more of that, especially, for women who are like who have experienced burnout and are kind of, getting back to work after going through a lot of challenges where
Mm-hmm.
what we might need to get through that process is some of the tools that you and I talked about, learning how to give ourselves what we need,
Mm-hmm.
get those small wins, etc. And so, yeah, I do speak at conferences, and I tend to lead conversations with a lot of founders and CEOs about things like mental health. And
Mm-hmm.
rather than just focusing on like how do we achieve our goals, I'm really interested in the question of like how can we achieve our goals and also have the kind of experience that is, like we talked about, transformative and fulfilling in the
Mm-hmm.
process of achieving those goals. So those are the types of organizations and events that I've spoken with. And I think the best way to reach me is probably through Instagram or my website. My Instagram is bailey.farren, and that's a place where I'll typically post about events that I'm going to be participating in or even hosting. I've really loved hosting virtual and in-person reading groups with women who are
Mm.
focused, that are thinking about either, changing their habits, setting goals, or self-care. Those are the three
Awesome.
areas that I love leading groups around. And so messaging me on Instagram is a really good way to get connected and maybe even participate in one of those groups.
Or they could just meet you on a plane that got delayed.
Or
That's
they could meet me on a plane.
a random encounter. No, again, that's what makes travel fun is you get to meet people from all over the world. And sometimes you can learn a lot. Sometimes you learn how not to do things.
Yeah,
And again, the way you were compassionate and empathetic to the situation, um, I was aware of that. And again, if you're in a situation and anyone watching this is in a situation where you see somebody do something that wow, that's pretty cool. Go up to that person, tell them that, let them know that. So maybe you'll develop a conversation like we did, or that person will feel like, hey, I need to do this more often because, right now, man, it's just, when you watch some of the stuff on the social media, just how just impatient and rude people are to other people, and just
yeah,
we're all trying to get somewhere. We all have deadlines. We all at times have financial guns to our head. We all have um, relationships that may not be the best. So let's be a little bit more empathetic with people. And so um, I try to look at people as stories now. And this has helped
mm,
me, Bailey, a lot. I think I told you that in the plane is like when I see people, I just don't see what I used to see. I used to see a CEO in a suit and think that guy's rich. I used to see a big weightlifter guy and think that guy's an NFL football player. Now I see the same body frame or the same color or the same what they're wearing, but I just see inside of them. Like
mm,
it's weird. It's almost like an empath. Like I can I don't think I'm an empath in regards to some people think they can see things and they can I don't feel that way. I just feel like I'm much more attentive to the fact that we're all in this together
yeah,
versus we're all in individual canoes fighting against the current of life, by ourselves. Nope, I'm in a big canoe with Bailey and myself and
hmm,
my brothers and just that's how I feel at this stage of my life. And I think we need to have more of that, not less of it. And so, again, thanks for taking the time today, being on the podcast. This was great. And I'm excited to follow your business. Now, how many years have you been launched? You Where are you
so
guys
I
at in this stage of your? Is it still a startup technically, or have you guys
yeah,
gone through the cycle?
yeah, we're definitely still a startup.
Okay.
So we started the business in 2019, and at that point it was mostly like researching the problem and, brainstorming the solution,
Mm-hmm.
meeting our first potential customers and getting feedback from them. So that was the first year. The second year, also COVID starting,
Oh,
was
geez.
fundraising and trying to build our first product without having raised really any money. And then the next year was actually raising money and preparing to, test the platform during fire season. And
Gotcha.
then doing that testing, we raised our second round of funding this year. And on January 1st of this year, we deployed for our first major natural disaster, which was a flood.
Hmm. Well, I'm very proud of you.
Thank
It's
you.
awesome what you've done, and I think lots of young eyes, men and women, are seeing young people, start following their dreams. Whatever it may be. Never give up. It sounds cliche-ish, but the reality is it's true.
Yeah.
Well, listen. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much, and
Thank you, Jeff.
it's been my honor. Okay.
Mine too. Thank you very much.